Welcome to Thinking Green. I'm Ronna, and for those of you who tuned in expecting to hear from Tyler Williams from SSDP at UConn, we switched our schedule around over the weekend so he wouldn't have to drive down from stores in the snow, and it actually turned out to be a very fortuitous switch. With me tonight is Jason Morris. Some of you who follow the education scene in New London know Jason. And the reason I say it's fortuitous is that just today in the day paper, there was an editorial, Keep Training Wheels on the New London Board of Ed. And though there was a little bit of a correct analysis of some of the problems, the editorial was so shallow and off the mark in many ways, and I'm really looking forward to having the opportunity for a much more in-depth discussion than what people got this morning from our paper. So welcome, Jason.
Thank you very much for having me.
I guess start out saying, how did you get involved with researching everything you could learn about education in New London?
Well, really, I began, you could just say, activism when Occupy began, and it just kind of gave me the empowerment to say that I can do something, that I'm not going to just be the person that watches and complains, that I can actually go out there and make something happen. And so with that, I just became just a sponge for information where I just needed to know everything about each issue that I was going to fight for. And over time, there was just so many issues. I had to whittle it down to just two, and I chose education because I have kids in the system, and there are some large issues that I felt needed to be addressed, and money in politics.
And all of that comes together here, really.
It does.
So I guess we can start out talking a little bit about where we are in New London right now. We're sort of at a crossroads in some ways, and in some ways it seems like things haven't changed much. So what would you say is our current state of public education in New London?
Well, right now we're in the middle of a magnet transition. We voted to go to a magnet district where every single school is a magnet school, and the motives behind that were purely financial. There was no other real good reason for it. They didn't have good research to say that, hey, magnet schools are better than traditional public schools, and there actually is no research to say that they're better. They say they're the same. The purpose of magnet schools was to desegregate our schools, where we have an urban population in our city. Over 80% are minority, and over 80% qualify for free and reduced lunch. And what the purpose of it was is just to bring kids in from the suburbans, from the outside districts, to desegregate.
And there is kind of a good motive behind that, because kids learn from each other. But I'm not sure that it's being planned to really make use of that particular draw.
No, I mean, the whole purpose behind it is to get the money from the state, where just about anywhere else there isn't a financial incentive to create a magnet school, where in our state there is. And the only reason also that, or I should say not the only reason, but one of the reasons that the state targeted us to say that, hey, that would work great for you, is because of our test scores, where since No Child Left Behind, they've decided to use test scores as the end-all be-all of whether you're failing or succeeding as a school, or as a student, as a teacher, as a state.
Now, let's talk a little bit about what the tests are testing. So what kind of tests are they basing this on?
So these are previously, before this year and partially last year, they were paper tests, bubble in, multiple choice, and then the English language or language arts. And these tests were definitely just for the interests of the state, and they can be arbitrarily set for whatever bar that they want. They don't really have any value for the purpose that we're using them for. there's over a century of research on testing and its benefits or its problems, and there are no benefits to using testing in the way that we are using it. So we find ourselves going through this whole system here for the past 14 years, 13 years with No Child Left Behind and then Race to the Top, basing everything that we do on tests that really don't have as much value as they chalk them up to be.
Well, you know, I was working for Head Start 15 years ago when it started, and there was a pre-test and post-test that started to be given to 4-year-olds that was explicitly not to plan individually for the needs of each child. And the courts actually threw that test out after a couple of years because there was no stated purpose. The non-stated purpose was to figure out which Head Start centers were being successful and which ones weren't. But the tests were, I don't want to say exactly rigged, but they were sort of geared towards rural poor kids doing better than urban poor kids. They'd have pictures of vocabulary words, and one was a picture of a swamp. Well, you know, if you're poor and you live in some places, you'll know what a swamp is. But if you're a 4-year-old in New London, you probably won't.
Right.
So, you know, it's one of my problems with some of these tests is that it's so easy to subtly gear it towards what the everyday experience might be of one child who lives in one place as opposed to in a different place.
Right, and these tests are being created by for-profit companies that don't have public oversight. Not even legislators can look at the tests. Parents definitely don't get to see it. Teachers definitely don't get to see it. And that just gets rid of, that's, you know, a lack of transparency, lack of accountability. How do we know these tests actually match up to the curriculum or what's relevant to the student? And the results are completely just bogus because you can't account for poverty. When you take out poverty out of the equation, when you're matching our test scores with the rest of the world, we're right up there with everyone else. But we have such high levels that keeps growing that you wonder why our tests are low. Well, we're in an urban district. We have more poverty than other areas in the state.
And a lot of households that don't speak English as well, which can follow a kid's ability to do well in these tests for many years, even if they can speak English, you know.
Exactly.
In a day-to-day way.
They require just 10 months of English instruction for a student that comes in who's ELL before they are told that you can now take the tests, which are completely, they're in English and there's no help for them, there's no translation, you just, good luck. And those results are counted against our entire district.
Now you started out talking about magnet schools being, one of the draws being that there's money attached to it. So do you know how is the money being spent?
That's one of the more curious things where at the beginning of all this, when we were deciding on whether or not we were going to go towards this or not, they were talking about how we could have a $9 million infusion from the state on if every school was magnet and we got the 25% of students from outside the district, we would get $9 million in state funding.
Which is huge because the budget is in the 40s.
Right. And so as we go forward, we have 2 elementary schools that are magnet, and we have the high school that's still magnet. High school just got last year a large grant that's going to be over multiple years to help it. That's from federal funding. But we haven't heard anything on where that's going and what that's doing. But what we have been seeing is administrators being hired. And teachers have been going down, but not necessarily because their jobs have been gotten rid of, but just that they are leaving for the conditions in our district right now. Back when we were flat funded for the 5th time in a row, that's when we saw a large amount of jobs that were actually cut. We lost 26 teaching positions, 46 positions total in the district, and we have not recovered from any of that.
And class sizes have only gotten bigger.
Right.
I think the cap was at 24 at the elementary school level 3 or 4 years ago, and now it's 28, I think.
Well, the contract, the teacher's contract has a limit of how many kids per teacher, and then once you go past that, you need a student aide or a teacher's aide. I believe it is 24, and then but we've had kindergarten classes of 28, where in districts nearby you have in the teens. You got Pawcatuck or Stonington with low teens in their kindergarten classes. It's just outrageous how we could have 28.
And one of the issues with the magnet schools is we have to convince families who live out of district that New London is the place for their kids. So how do we do that?
Well, right now we have a big PR campaign that is coming from money from Adamowski, and that's radio ads, and that's ads in the paper and mailers and all sorts of things. And then ways that kids are coming from, say, middle school to our high school or elementary school to our middle schools eventually, is the Science and Tech Magnet High School sends gifts to the guidance counselors at other districts. They send umbrellas and blankets and sweaters and hats, and they have luncheons, and they wine them and dine them to try to get them to send kids over. But that helps them counsel them towards our district.
So the goal of desegregating seems like a very honorable one, you know. Although we're not a chef district, I'm sure the Chef O'Neill decision encouraged us to try to have suburban kids and city kids sitting in classrooms together, but it doesn't seem like it's worked out exactly as intended.
Well, we have been getting, we hit our mark for, I believe it was Nathan Hale. We almost got it for Winthrop, and they expect to get it next year. And it's doing what we said it would do, would be desegregate, and that's working. But like I was saying, with magnet schools, they don't actually do better than regular traditional schools, and when the entire point of it is to raise test scores, that's all you're really looking at. You're not necessarily looking at, how well are they actually learning, because you can't look at the test scores as being a measure of their academic achievement. So it's really just all about the test scores on whether we're going to, or whether they think that we are achieving or not.
Yeah, it seems to me it almost encourages a kind of game playing that everyone wants to import the students who are going to get high test scores for a variety of reasons and export the ones who are getting low test scores, but nothing is really about raising each individual child to his or her greater potential.
Right, we continue our path of standardization in many ways, and one of the ways that I was most troubled by when my son was in Jennings was I went in for teacher-parent conference, and the first thing that was shown to me was, here's his MAP scores, measures of academic progress. And I said, I'm all set with that, thank you, but maybe you can show me your authentic assessments that you've created to gauge my son throughout the year so far. And she said, we're not actually allowed to do authentic assessments, which those are created by the teacher. She has her curriculum. She can create tests along the way and quizzes and ways to measure as the time goes on, but they're not allowed to do that. They have to use workbooks, and everything is just copy out of the workbook and do whatever Pearson is telling them to do, the manufacturer, the publisher. And it shouldn't be one size fits all. Every single child learns differently, and a workbook for thousands of kids is not going to be is not the right way to teach.
Now, we don't have time to go into this issue in great detail, but you mentioned Pearson, and we've talked about money. So what's happening in our schools so far are all publicly funded. They're magnets, but they're administered through our Board of Education. But there's a big growth of charter schools in a lot of urban districts in Connecticut. And it's being driven by companies like Pearson.
Right, so I mean, just from the last, you could say, 8-7 years, it just becomes so apparent and so just out there. Like, they don't care that it's publicly known that they're putting so much money into education reform. You have the Gates Foundation, who has put millions into the creation of Common Core, which was created by two non-government organizations that have government-sounding titles, and the people who formed them it's like 30 to 40 people, and 2 of them were educators, but they weren't educators of K through 12. So it was business interests, it was textbooks and publishers and technology and all the big players who stand to profit from education reform created the majority of the reforms that we're seeing today. And they're actually business reforms that they tried and failed. This is just one of the reports that I was reading online about how, this reform in education was tried in business. Here's what happened, and it completely failed. And you wonder why we're seeing the same thing with education.
Well, yeah, which brings us in a way to what the purpose of education should be. But I want to bring this back to New London a little bit, because one of the goals with the magnet schools is to create several pathways related to different subject matters. Mm-hmm. And of course, we started out with the science and technology magnet high school, and we have Winthrop School, and the science pathway is being developed in the middle school level to connect it. Right. But what's kind of more interesting in its evolution is the arts pathway. So maybe you can talk a little bit about the arts pathway as it's evolving.
Right, so it initially began where they wanted to, we already have an elementary school that is based with arts, but we needed to fill in the pathways because we were figuring out pathways from K through 12, fill in the rest through middle and high school. And so the initial plan was to use Isaac as a middle school filler, and then the high school would be a combination of the Gard Arts Center and the New London High School. Well, unfortunately for us, in some ways, unfortunately for Isaac, they dodged that bullet because they were a little upset when they found out that they were going to be plugged in as the middle school piece because they weren't talked about it. They weren't talked to before it was announced. So
now their management has changed since they were conceived of, correct? They've become more of a real charter school. Right,
and they've always had, just a separate board. They have a board of directors, and they have their own interests of running the school. And so when you announce a large change to the public school around them that says that, hey, you're going to be a part of it, and they don't know what you're talking about, it doesn't make them feel too warm and fuzzy on it. And so through negotiations, they ended up saying no thank you, but it's not going to really fit our mission, is what the official statement was. And now we see the high school coming on board, where we are looking for alternatives for the middle school now. The high school is now being focused on, where the Gard Arts Center and New London High School are going to be sort of a co-campus situation. And in order to get the Gard Arts Center to be used for our high school, we had to renovate, or we had to renovate large amounts of spaces for them. They had been asking the state for a renovation grant for a long time to expand their theater and to renovate some upper levels of, I forget what section of it is, but just down State Street there. So we said, okay, well, how about if we come up with this plan, we'll use those spaces, we'll push the state to say, hey, you can get those grants, and it'll all get renovated. You have a nice, beautiful working space, where before it's gutted, it's trash, it's There's nothing. It just looks nice on the outside, but there's nothing on the upper floors there. And we'll get to use it for a school. I was initially concerned about how long that would last because I didn't want the state to be spending so much money on renovating the Guard for free. It's a grant. And then 5 years later, oh, we have another idea and let's move the high school out or this isn't working. So we have it in the MOU to give it to the school district for 20 years. I feel that's fair. And hopefully we can either continue it on or we'll have more options for space after that. But the particularly interesting parts of the MOU, that majority of it was the usual legalese and everything. The first reading of it everything seemed fine. It was going all right. But then the second reading of it, when the public finally got a hold of it and a few board members, they started to point out a couple issues. So in state law, it says that every school that does not meet annual yearly progress, which is standardized test scores, above a certain amount, they need to have school governance councils. These councils are made up of parents, teachers, community members, and at the high school level, students.
And actually, it's a good idea for every school.
It is. It's a proven education reform, you could say. It has a lot of research backing that more parent, teacher, student, community member involvement improves the school.
And how are these school governance councils made up?
Well, you have an equal amount just about of teachers and parents, and then you have about 2 community members and I believe it's 2 students.
So it really
high
has
school
the
level.
potential to help the community and the families and the schools work together.
Right, yeah. And they talk about a lot of things. Well, they're supposed to talk about a lot of things. They talk about they're supposed to know about every program in the school. They talk about budget considerations as going forward. What do we have? What do we need? What's going on? And they review achievement data. Well, over the many years, we've been not so much in compliance with the laws with the state on having those fully functioning, as I was a part of a school governance council for at least 1 school year and monitored them after. Well, the stipulations in this new arts pathway high school state that this isn't a typical school governance council. This one, instead of advising on budget, actually allocates money on the budget.
And how's the makeup?
They're made up of half, I think it's 12 or 15, 12 or 15, half are Guard representatives and half are New London Public Schools appointees.
So it's like a governing board, not really an inclusive council.
Right, very similar to what we see, say, in Isaac or a charter school, where when you say New London Public Schools appointees, it doesn't say parents, it doesn't say students, it doesn't even say teachers. It could be anyone that they want. It could be anyone with interests in this new high school. So that leads into, when we talk about interests, and we continue to talk about money always, in the language it also talks about how the school is able to take in private donations, where I've never seen that before in any other public school.
Right, they have PTOs, but not the school board itself.
Right, so, and it's just the school's governing entity is able to reach out to private individuals, organizations, and nonprofits in order to take in money. And I have a large issue with that because it creates a system of just inequality. It just perpetuates inequality. Well, say my daughter, if my daughter is in the arts high school where she loves art, she loves singing, she loves dancing and all that, if she's there and I win the lottery, I can toss millions of dollars into that high school, and now my daughter's getting whatever the benefits of that is, and the rest of the district isn't. That's the purpose of having an education nonprofit for New London. I think we have the New London Education Foundation. And so they solicit to individuals and to organizations and such, say, hey, we have a great program that we want to fund for the district, whatever, and they take in donations for that, and then they like award it to the school district to implement across the district. So that was another concern. So we have the governing board is not a real publicly accountable and transparent board. Private donations, and then the priority of the renovations was pretty curious. So all three of these things really just like came in all at the same time. And the priority of renovations goes with, hey, by the way, it was about 32 million, but now that we talk about it a little bit more, it's going to be around 40, 41 or something like that, 42. And the priority of renovations is going to be, we're going to work on the theater first, the main theater, the stuff that we want, and then second priority, phase 2, then we'll work on the school stuff, and that'll be for you, and you're a lower priority than the rest of the Guard.
And it's really disappointing because this sounds like it could be something that's fantastic.
It does, yeah.
I mean, who doesn't want their child who is artistically inclined to have that kind of education?
Right, with a theater right there, with professional equipment available to do anything from lighting to, just the back work to video to actual performance.
So that part sounds great, but I think as so often happens with this sort of issue is like the devil is in the details, and yes, we need to have people looking at the details.
And we do. Myrna Martinez, the only sole Green Party member on the board, she pointed this out at the meeting and was, everybody wants to pass it. Everyone wants to get it up to the state because if we don't get it there quick, then maybe they won't approve it. And so she was like, okay, well, it's a provisional approval, and we can change things, right? I want to continue negotiations, is what I remember hearing at the board meeting.
Yeah.
And they said, oh yeah, well, we'll continue negotiations, but in spectator sport over here in the crowd, I'm looking at them going, every document that gets approved by this board never really gets changed much after it's approved. And we talk about
it's really actually hard to change the momentum.
Mm-hmm. And you, as a board member, you have so many things being thrown at you. You say, oh, we got this one done, approved. Oh, now it's off your shoulders. You don't want to bring it back.
And I think I wanted to connect this too because it sounds like such a great idea, and I still think it could be implemented in a way that's great, but I don't know if that's the way we'll implement it. A lot of this education reform actually has fantastic publicity. I mean, they have rhetoric that is really inspirational. So I remember seeing a little Facebook ad for Teach for America, and the ad said something like if you think everyone is entitled to a great education. And it isn't until after you click that they show you, oh, it's Teach for America.
Right.
So it's like they have the words, and they can express the dreams that people want, but sometimes that doesn't really match up with what's really being peddled here.
Right, because the common parent would like to have trust in our elected officials, in our elected representatives in the state, at the federal side, that they are reviewing these reforms and these big changes in our education system across the nation with research behind it, with real facts, and that it's all based on how kids learn and not necessarily how companies profit, which is really what we're seeing. And so they can use those words, and that they can use those vague statements and say every kid should have a great education,
right,
but they don't really know what's really behind those statements and what that organization is doing. We actually had 6,000 teachers, students, parents, and such go out to a protest for equality in our schools in Hartford. And it was all organized by a company, an organization that is definitely not working in those interests,
But their name is attached to it.
right?
So let's talk a little bit about what the big issues that we're facing in New London education right now that are parent concerns, community concerns, and concerns for people who care about education. Discipline.
Right, yeah. We had the NLPA came to the board last June with a report that we worked on for months with great help from some community members, parents, college professors. It was a great undertaking that we did. And I was a part of that. I've been working with the NLPA for 3 years now or so. And we presented to the board that here are the statistics, here's the data. Everybody loves data. You want to keep
Sure.
right? You like to use data, so let's bring it to you. Here's the data on student discipline, and it was just so disproportionately high towards Black and brown
Like
minorities.
expulsion and suspension type
suspensions, just normal infractions were over. It was like something around 14,000, just general infractions that violated the school policy. And it was mostly based around the use of zero tolerance. And it just so happened that the federal government put out a guidance package that was saying it's time to get away from zero tolerance. It is discriminatory. It's perpetuating the school-to-prison pipeline, and we need to change our policies into something like restorative justice. So when we presented that, we got some response, and they said, "This is a great idea. Let's start a working group, etc." And that's what we're currently working on. And we invited a lot of just community members, administrative staff, teachers, stakeholders in the community, people who are interested in this issue, to come together and let's work on, hey, what are other districts that have implemented it? How did they implement it? What are the pieces that they decided to take? Because there's so many different ways or solutions using restorative justice. And then here in June, we plan to bring those recommendations to the board.
Now, if anyone who's watching, wanted to get involved at all in NLPA, New London Parent Advocates, how would they go about doing that?
They can contact me. I'm on Facebook, Jason Morris, and they can contact a few other people. Just let's see, like say Ronna would be able to forward them on to me. She's a board member. You can find her on the website. Laura Burfoot works with the Hearing Youth Voices, and a couple other people that work with us.
And Hearing Youth Voices has also been working on a related issue. I know they did a presentation comparing the New London policies with policies in other districts, and they're trying to bring it in line because, I mean, we know that in the news there's been so much in terms of the police department incidents all over the country. And I myself am not so interested in accusing an individual of being racist, but we have to think about what our institutions are doing. And the zero tolerance is usually in city schools, poor schools.
Right, because there's like a general feeling of these kids need to have more structure. These kids need more discipline. Don't give them any leeway. Oh, you give them an inch, they'll take a mile. Where the kids aren't really much different.
And it's honestly, in some ways, the opposite, I think, because the city kids don't get as much outdoor time. And, you know, some of them live in places that don't have safe backyards. And so, you know, they need that.
That's a thing that we've been unfortunately going through for the past 10, 20 years of just a fear-mongering of you can't send your kids outside. Look, this happened, this happened, this happened in these parts of the state, but it's because we've been pushing it out through the media. Hey, this is happening. Well, it's always really kind of happened. And they found in a study about violence, it plateaued in the early to mid 90s as lead poisoning was finally subsiding because of the, I believe it was
Right.
the environmental protection or whichever.
They took
government-
lead out of the gasoline back around
gasoline,
then.
paints, lead abatement, all that stuff. And so violence has been on a downtrend ever since then, and we're actually at a 40-year low for
And if you
personal
look-
violence between people.
Wow. And if you look at the elite schools, those kids get a lot of leeway.
Oh, yeah.
And we do have a phone call. Hi, thanks for calling. Oh, wait, that is. Hi, thanks for calling.
Hi, this is Dennis from New London. Hey,
Hi.
Ronna, Jason. I'm sitting here listening to you talking about zero tolerance. I'm assuming we're talking New London High School. And I'm curious on the numbers as far as the percentage of black, brown, and white. What's the percentage of students?
We have around, I believe it was around 87 or 84% minority representation in our student body.
And
And what would that be? So the rest of it would be, percentage would be white children in the school?
Yes, right. Like white, I think Asian is included in there.
yeah, I think when I was on the board, about 50% of the students were Hispanic or Latino, about 35% were African American,
Right.
10 to 15% were white, and the other 5% were
And
everything else.
It's important to note that the statistics that we brought to the board, the data was the entire district, so elementary schools, middle school, and high school.
And
Where
I-
it's mostly, it's very troubling to have.
When you talk about, you were talking about a disproportionate amount of zero tolerance towards, I guess, minorities, but I'm sure white kids in the school are disciplined as much if they act up as anybody else in the school.
I don't know if
Wouldn't
that's,
it, because of the percentage being so much higher, wouldn't that play into the numbers of why it seems disproportionate?
It does play into the numbers, like I see what you're saying, but there's plenty of evidence just across the nation in multiple studies just about how, Sally, blonde hair, blue eyes, a white girl will do the same thing as, Tommy, brown hair, brown skin, does the same infraction, but one will be given a lesser of a punishment than the other.
and NLPA has been accumulating the data, so you might be interested in coming to hear when they report in June. But
Plus, we have the report available online.
the other point I wanted to make is district-wide, it isn't just a matter of picking out, well, this child who is darker is going to be treated differently from the white child. It's the whole district that has more poor kids and more brown kids.
Well,
The
I agree with-
policies are more strict. And I'll give you an example. New London schools at the elementary and middle schools have uniforms, wear uniforms. The kids in Waterford, East Lyme, Groton do not wear uniforms. Already, every New London child, whether white, black, Asian, they have more rules to follow from day one.
Right.
And they might have consequences if their uniform is ripped or gets dirty and they come to school without it. No child in Waterford is going to ever miss recess for a uniform offense. It happens in New London quite frequently. So it's not on a child-to-child basis, it's that the city districts
Overall.
have more rules. And one thing that Hearing Youth Voices has done is compare policies at different school districts.
On credit
and
loss.
they're trying, and credit loss is one of their big ones that they're looking at, that compare the different districts' policies, and poorer districts tend to have less tolerant policies. And I think that affects the academic potential of the kids, because instead of learning from your mistakes, you get punished for your mistakes from a very young age, and you know, you learn
It
from your
seems to me that
mistakes.
if you're going to have a zero tolerance in a school, it needs to be directed at individuals as far as who's acting up or whatever they're doing.
No, it shouldn't be directed at any
Zero
student.
tolerance. I mean, if it's going down in the schools where they're picking by race, who's going to get punished and who's not,
No.
then you're right, the whole system needs to be changed.
That's
Yeah.
the point of the federal government's guidance to say that get rid of zero tolerance, use restorative justice, is because it's not just our district, it's every district, even though, you know, the most suburban.
Can you explain to me real quick about this justice?
Restorative justice.
Justice.
Okay, I'm going to hang you
Hang
up,
up.
but we'll talk about restorative justice, and there
All
are
right,
things.
thanks, Ronna.
But thanks for calling. Do you want to define, you know, give a picture of what restorative justice looks like?
Sure.
Thank you, Dennis.
With zero tolerance, you have if you do this, this happens. It's very much more black and white, and it also becomes more of a discretionary for the teacher or the administrator.
And it might be a fairly small offense, like
Right.
you come with a bread knife or something.
Something, anything. So that's with zero tolerance, but with restorative justice, there are many different methods that you can use, and it really depends on what school and where you are, and you have to tailor it for your school and for your district. But like one option is to have peer juries in high schools. So you have a fight that happened, and the two people go in front of the jury and they explain what happened, they talk about their issues, and they can come to a conclusion, the jury can come to a conclusion on exactly what should happen in this case. You have peer circles where the two students, or however many students, come together and they talk about whatever issue they have with each other, and they can just vent. And, you know, it may not even be that they have a problem with each other. It could just be like, you know, I was up till 2 in the morning last night working at McDonald's because I need to have a job also while going to high school, and I didn't get much sleep, and I was just grumpy, and, you know, he pissed me off real quick.
And this is an educational process too, because however you organize the restorative justice circles, students have to put themselves in the other's shoes to some extent, and that is a huge educational concept, to be able to see things from a point of view that isn't just me.
Right, because we're so
If you're just missing recess or sitting in detention, you don't learn that. And
right, and
it's
they have
really
alternative methods for what happens. Say, okay, you know, it was a violation. We've come to an understanding. We worked it out. Well, okay, now what are you going to do? It was a violation. So what are we going to do to correct it? Well, you have the apology process, and you have, say, working with a teacher on a project, or doing a project that has to do with, you know, challenging yourself, challenging your emotions, and like you were saying, with stepping inside someone else's shoes. So it could be volunteering. There's many options. We're really at the beginning phase of it, and we haven't gone into detailing and listing out all the possibilities, but it has huge implications to really turn around our district when it comes to discipline outcomes, where we have Bridgeport that had a huge percentage. I don't have it in my mind right now off the tip of my tongue, but they had a huge percentage drop in expulsions and suspensions and such by going to restorative justice.
well, I guess it makes sense for us now to move to one problem in the schools: bullying. It's a huge concern of parents, and not just in schools, but in workplace and, you know, everyday life. Bullying has received a lot of exposure. So what is happening in the New London schools about bullying?
Well, I believe it was back in 2012 when the state passed legislation on bullying. They said this is our guidance, and every district needs to come up with a policy that takes care of these lists of things. And our district did come up with a policy, but I noticed inconsistencies where the state law says this, our policy doesn't say that. So how are students able to, in this case, anonymously report bullying in our district? And parents are supposed to be informed on that method, and students are supposed to be informed on that method every year. I brought it up. I went through the chain. I talked to the right people. Hey, can you show me this? Can you show me this? I'm trying to find where it says it because it's not. I don't see it anywhere, and I didn't get informed, and my daughter and my son wasn't informed. So where is it? And eventually, after I believe it was a month or two, I've just poked hard enough and CC'd the right amount of people to get it so that they send it to their lawyers, and their lawyers came back with, hey, here's the revision. And we have that, and we have multiple other revisions where it was actually so changed that there wasn't any markings on the policy when it went up to the board. And usually when a board sees a change in policy, they have this is what's changed, what's deleted, what's new and such. There wasn't any markings.
This was like just a brand new policy.
Right. And so as they were talking about it, a concern that came up, because we talk about attracting students to our district and bullying on the minds of our students and how they want to feel safe. Unfortunately, our chairman said that it was a waste of time to consider and pass.
Now, did it get passed?
It did get passed, yes, but it was hard to speak after that.
Well, we have about 4 minutes left, and I wanted to use at least part of it to go back and talk a little bit about testing, not the goods and bads of testing itself, but what the legal aspect is if parents decide they don't want their kids to take these tests.
Okay, yeah. So they can call it opting out, or they can call it refusing, and refusing is really the more empowering and the maybe even say proper term, because in the state of Connecticut there is no provisions for opting your student out of, or your child out of this test. And that's any test. That's the MAP test. You can say, I don't want them to take the MAP test, I don't want them to take DRA, I don't want them to take the CMTs or the new SBAC. I don't want them to take any of that. And Connecticut doesn't have any legal ramifications for it. And it's because there shouldn't be. When it comes to the Supreme Court, they ruled decades ago that the parents have their parental rights over the child's education, of the direction of the child's education. So you can tell the school, my child is not going to take the test. And they're going to they were actually directed to say, there's no provision for you cannot do that, you have to take the test, or they have to take the test, and then you have to say, I understand there is no provision, but they're not taking the test. And then they have to find something else for them to do. And it's really about starving the nonprofit organizations, the state, and everything.
It's sort of like a boycott of the tests.
Right. It's starving them of the data
companies
to tell us that our school is failing, because they're using this data and their arbitrary bar to jump over to say that our schools are failing when there's really no research back behind it.
So if a person, now do you have to give written notice to
It
the
could be
school?
an email. That's how my wife did it. My ex-wife, excuse me.
Okay. Well, I have one more question. We have 2 more minutes. Is there anything in particular in the New London schools right now that gives you hope for the next year or so?
Well,
I hope it's not nothing.
I mean, the new superintendent has a lot of experience, and the likelihood, based on his past experience and his past jobs and positions, that he'll come in as a shining armor, research-backed education reformer, and let's do things based on how kids learn, is unfortunately unlikely. But he does what the board says. So if the board goes by what's right for the kids, then they can make it happen. And we have a campaign season coming up, and we have a budget that we're working on right now, and we're going to be fighting.
Well, we'll see you, I guess, in the trenches, in the board meetings. And
Definitely.
I recommend that people go to the board meetings because they're not always as well attended as like council meetings.
Right.
So thank you, Jason. Next
Thank you.
week, as I said, Tyler Williams, who is active in Students for Sensible Drug Policy at UConn, will be our guest and talk about how our drug policies are affecting our youth. So thanks again, Jason, and
Thanks for having me.
I'll see you.